exit only because of a problem with one of the escalators. LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning to you. 3 minutes after 8 on Tuesday, February the 6th, and part of that conversation will be your opportunity to put your calls and questions to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police here in London, Cressida Dick. But I need to tell you just how the FTSE is starting. The FTSE 100 starts at 73.34, closing down 108 points yesterday. That's around 1.5%. I remind you, the Nikkei was down by just under 5%. So, and of course, we saw that horrific day over in the US. They've obviously yet to wake up. We will chronicle that through the course of my show, I assure you, and tell you what happens with those with the FTSE 100. More on that in around half an hour or so's time. Now, to policing matters, and in the studio I say, Commissioner Cressida, welcome, thank you for coming.
Good morning.
No one will feel these figures more keenly than you and the men and women who serve under you. The sharp rise in knife crime, a rise of just over 30%, sharp rise also in gun crime. What's the Met doing about it, Commissioner?
So we're out and about bearing down on these crimes. The figures you're talking about, I think, relate to probably to September last year.
12 months of September, 13,715 incidents, a rise of 30.2%. And also an increase, tragically, of fatal stabbings as well, a 23% increase from the previous year.
So the increase in fatal stabbings is horrendous, and I think everybody in London is aware of that. We're working with a whole load of people from the police point of view. We're out on the streets. We're arresting people, we're stopping and searching people, we're taking knives off the streets, we're locking people up. Just this morning, I was out with a team in Camden. Fantastic job. We knocked on somebody's door very early. We've got back a whole load of phones and other stolen property.
Knives?
And this was in... they're still searching. We'll see. But this is in relation to...
You were there, though, for the raid.
I was there, and this is in relation to...
This is intelligence-led,
knife point
obviously.
robberies, intelligence-led operation, knife point robberies, moped-enabled robberies. In the last few months, for example, moped-enabled robberies have been reducing, and reducing quite dramatically. And you know how high they got last summer. Knife crime is beginning to tail off, and that's due to the great work by my officers out on the streets of London all the time.
No one's questioning the work they do and their bravery, but do we need more stop and search, Commissioner?
We are, in fact, doing more stop and search. When I became Commissioner, I said that I wanted my officers, who are very professional, they are very well trained, and they are supported by body-worn video, to use stop and search confidently against habitual knife carriers and people they suspect legitimately to be carrying weapons. That's what they're doing. They're doing it more and more. Stop and search is on the rise.
So how does intelligence work? A local team has an idea of... that they've got an idea that I might be carrying a knife. How do they work it out?
So it will depend on the circumstances. It does vary a great deal, but in essence, you'll be aware that we have an intelligence system. And let's say, Nick, you were regularly being stopped and you were talking about robberies to my officers, or someone near you was talking about the robberies that you were doing at knife point, or in the last 3 months we had stopped you 3 times before with a knife. All these things will come together to give the officers potentially the beginnings of reasonable grounds to stop and search you. That's what our communities want us to be doing. We're doing that in a really transparent way, and we're getting loads of support all across London for doing it.
And the raid you went on this morning was in some way to do with knives? Was it someone had been using knives?
Knife point robberies, sometimes on a moped, sometimes on a bike, and sometimes walking along. Yep.
Okay, we'll wait to hear what comes from that.
Thank you.
Let's put your calls through. Vicky is in Streatham. Vicky, you're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead, Vicky. Good morning to you.
I am a rape survivor and also twice a domestic violence survivor. My daughter was sexually assaulted age 6 in her school, and each time I've had the police out to me, they have treated me as the perpetrator rather than the person that was being violent towards me, to the point where I've had to complain. I went to the IPCC, my paperwork was lost, etc., etc. And I have felt that the police force is institutionally sexist. And I'd like to understand what you do about screening officers for use of sexist materials such as pornography and basically hatred towards women.
I just checked, none of this is live or current at the moment, is it, with the IPCC or any trials or anything? I just need to check for legal reasons. No. OK, stay on the line, Vicky. You will come back. Commissioner.
So, Vicky, I'm sorry to hear you feel you've had those sorts of experiences. I'm also surprised. what we are seeing is more and more people are coming forward to talk about sexual offences, to talk about violence in the home. And when I talk to victims groups and I talk to victims themselves a lot, the vast majority of the feedback I get is very, very positive. And this is a big change in the last, I joined over 30 years ago. We are very much more professional. We are very much more empathetic. I can't obviously discuss the details of your case because I'm not aware, but I'd be very happy to speak to you after the programme. But we do take the standards, the professional standards of our officers very seriously. And we do, of course, do background checks. If we get any information to suggest that somebody is unprofessional, we'll act on that. And of course, as you will be aware, we do quite regularly end up asking people to resign.
Great response from you, Vicky.
I'm afraid I don't buy that. And also the majority of women that I interact with on various different websites don't buy that either, which is why the reporting rate is so tiny for rape and domestic violence, because most of the victims fear the police as opposed to actually trust them.
My experience is that the trust in the police has gone up enormously over the last several years. I can't get these figures exactly right, but we are seeing huge increases in the number of people who report to us, doubling in just a few years, both in terms of domestic violence and serious sexual offences. We do talk to people, we survey them, and as I say, the vast majority of people that I talk to do feel that they're getting a very good service from us.
Vicky, stay on the line. What we'll do is we'll take your details, because I sense the Commissioner would like to, or get one of her team to engage with you a little bit more. So if you want to give your details, you don't have to. We will pass them on, obviously in confidence, to the Commissioner, as we have done with previous Commissioners. We move on. Thank you for your call, Vicky. Jim's in Broxbourne, and you're through to Cressida. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to ask you a question about the trials that have recently collapsed due to failure to disclose.
Yes, what is your question? This is, of course, prompted in part by the Liam Allen case, which is now, of course, Mr. Allen has received an apology from the Met. What is your question, Jim?
My question is it down to a lack of resources or individual officer incompetence?
Commissioner.
Thank you, Jim. This is something that's causing, I know, the public a lot of concern, not just in London but beyond. Something I'm taking very seriously indeed. I'd like to say that I'm absolutely clear. My officers do act fairly. They do act impartially. I have seen no sign whatsoever of anything failing to be disclosed as a result of malice or ill will. It is a very, very complicated system that we are working in. And there are, as you've probably read, ever-increasing amounts of digital media that the officers have to look at, particularly in cases where the two parties, as in most serious sexual offences, for example, domestic violence, child abuse investigations, know each other. So they have to work their way through a mountain of material. And this is becoming more and more difficult. So at one level, yes, there is a question about resources. But you'll have heard, as Nick has said, we apologise to Mr. Allen. There have been things that have gone wrong. We're currently doing a huge review.
What's a huge review, Commissioner? How many when we say huge?
Well, we are looking at about 600 of our cases, and I anticipate in the sort of months and years to come, we will be having to put more time, more resource into getting disclosure right.
That speaks to Jim's point, doesn't it?
Does.
Have you got enough resources?
Well, as I've said to you before, you ask any police chief, they always want more resources. You can't do something for nothing, so I will have to move resource from another area in order to make sure... In order to make sure that it's, the primary thing we must do is act fairly and bring people to justice in a proper and legitimate way. It is unthinkable that somebody who is innocent is found guilty.
Which could have happened in Mr. Allen's case, Commissioner.
Well, potentially, yes. Of course, it's quite possible that. I mean, it's. We've apologised to Mr. Allen. Yes. I'm very pleased that we're not in that position. Sometimes material is well known, not in Mr. Allen's case, but sometimes material is well known to a defendant and they don't tell us about it until very late in the day. That can look like a disclosure failure. Other times, the material is incredibly hard to find.
Yes.
What we don't want are any miscarriages of justice. What we do have is an action plan. We will have to put some more resources into that, and I have to ensure that my officers are feeling well trained and well supported, and where possible have the best technology that can support them in this work.
Okay, quick response from you, Jim.
Well, I was a serving police officer for 30 years. My wife was just retired through ill health.
I'm sorry, Jim.
She worked in a North London borough, and it got to a stage where they couldn't even put stamps on to letters because of budget restraints. Now, when you're talking about somebody, and I've read that the last case about the slavery case, where there was 57,000 text messages alone that the officer had to singly go through. Now, that's a mountain of work. And when this government are cutting police numbers in the way that they are, then something has got to give.
Yeah. Well, you make a very good point, Jim, and it's easy, I think, for people who don't work within the police or indeed within the criminal justice system to say, this is simply incompetence. But you know, and I know, that the volume of material on our phones, if Nick looked at his phone now, I look at mine, it's going up by the minute. And you know that has to be downloaded, and we have to follow reasonable lines of inquiry, and we have to look at it. That case is not unusual at all. In fact, just last week I was with the human trafficking team. They were telling me about case after case after case where they have to look at over 50,000 bits of material simply to see whether there is anything which may be relevant. And that is a very big task. The legislation was brought in 20 years ago, and not at a time of the digital world. So I'm very pleased that the Attorney General is going to do a much bigger review. Meanwhile, we're getting on top of our caseload as best we possibly can to make sure that we do a professional job.
You talk about there being no malice or ill will last year on this commissioner, but there was clearly incompetence. How come the detective constable involved, is still in post?
So we looked at all the circumstances, and I am very clear that this officer did not do anything, as you say, deliberately wrong.
No, I
he made a mistake. He made a mistake. He made some mistakes. Other people in the process made some mistakes. It is not my view that he should have been
If you don't lose your job for that, what do you lose your job for?
Well, all I can say is I've looked at all the detail, as has my head of professional standards, and we're both completely content that he should not have been disciplined for what happened.
But
he made a genuine mistake. He's asked to work in another sphere, and I completely understand why. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay. Completely understand why he wouldn't want to carry on in this world any longer in that particular role.
All right. We move, Jim. Thank you. We move to other questions. Michael in Loughton, you're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead, Michael.
Hello, Nick. Hello, Commissioner.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wondered what your view was on whether you feel women are being adequately protected through the criminal justice system, especially when you consider the recent case of John Warboys and his potential imminent release. What your thoughts are on that?
Commissioner.
We all know that there's far too much sexual violence. Not just affecting women, sometimes affecting men as well. And we do also know that taking a case through the criminal justice system can be really quite tough for people. As I said in an earlier answer, we've got a great deal better at the way in which we support people, the way in which we listen to people, the way in which we seek evidence, and the way in which we will help them through the processes, including going to court. But it is a big thing for somebody to do, and I think I'm not going to comment on the specifics of that case. I'm certainly not. Well, I'm not going to comment on the parole board decision. I don't think that's appropriate for me to do.
But what you could, I appreciate you weren't commissioned back in 2008, between 2006 and 2008 when Warboys was operating, 2009 when he was convicted. But it would appear the police did not pursue as many cases as they might have done.
So I think we've been very clear at the very beginnings of his when his offending first came to notice of the police, we did not do the job that we should have done, and we've said that all along. We've subsequently investigated, I believe, extremely thoroughly all the matters that have come to us, and we have cooperated with the Crown Prosecution Service, who of course make the decisions about what people are charged with and who goes to court for what. I think we've done a very professional job in relation to that, and I have no concerns about that.
It's been reported you're having a look at other cases.
I do absolutely understand why people, will feel concerned about this case. Absolutely, and there's been a real outcry. I understand that too. Of course, if anybody comes forward to us now with a further allegation, we'll take that seriously.
Is that not ongoing?
I'm not going to give you a ticker tape on what is going on, but I think we did confirm maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago that we had one report, and that related to a matter from quite a long time ago. And of course, we have been investigating that matter. If anybody else
is that active?
If anybody else is out there who believes that they may have been seriously sexually assaulted by him or indeed anybody else, then of course we would want them to come and talk to us.
But is that active? That case you just mentioned a couple of weeks ago, is that being investigated?
We've confirmed that we're investigating that.
That's
yes.
currently being investigated.
We've confirmed that we're investigating that.
Okay, we've been speaking with a woman called Deborah, who was a victim of John Warboys. She was raped in 2003 when she was picked up from a night out with her colleagues in Chelsea. For 6 years she had no memory of what happened to her. She finally remembered in 2009 during the publicity given to the Warboys case. This is a little of what she's told us exclusively, and her voice has been changed.
And I went to the police, but my story was quite vague. So I gave a statement, and the first question they asked me is, what were you wearing? Which I found quite insulting. The fact that I was wearing long black trousers and a long black sleeve top, which was my work clothes, I felt quite adamant that I wasn't wearing anything to encourage anyone. But I still think they were wrong to say that to me. Then over a period of about 2 weeks, I started to get flashbacks. So I went back to the police and I said, I've remembered much more this time. And they said, oh, well, he's already going to prison, so if you just send your statement in. And I had a coat that had a stain on it since then. I put it in the wardrobe and just forgotten it was there, basically. So they took the coat for evidence, and then after a while I asked them, could I have my coat back, what's going on? And they said the CPS are not going to press charges because he's already in prison and it's a waste of public money.
Now, Commissioner, that we go back more than 10 years to what Deborah's claiming went on. How has the handling of potential rape victims changed in those 10 years, would you say? Because I'm sure you would agree it's irrelevant what the woman might or might not have been wearing.
It's certainly not right to make any judgment about what she might or might not have been wearing. In history, I think we heard stories of police people and indeed other people in the court system drawing attention to the fact somebody was wearing a short skirt. That is completely wrong and indeed is sort of excluded now. That's one of the things that has changed. Yeah. You're quite right. However, it may be factually important simply to know what somebody was wearing. And certain circumstances, we do take a detail statement which will take a lot of detail. So it isn't always wrong for a police officer to ask somebody.
Her concern.
Absolutely, I completely see her concern. So what we have is hugely specially trained officers whose job it is to work with people who are making a complaint of a sexual offence. They are screened, they're very professional, and as I say, they're very highly trained, and they're very good at it.
Commissioner, clearly they said, well, don't worry, we've got him, he's going behind bars, don't worry about it. That's not professional, is it?
Well, I don't want to comment on the detail of that. What I would say is that I believe, and I've looked at them with my colleagues, I believe we did a professional set of investigations. We then applied the standards that the CPS had given us, and we passed the cases to the CPS for them to have a look at. There are a multitude of reasons why things may not end up being prosecuted. One of those, of course, is if somebody is, as Deborah said, she was very vague about what happened initially. The CPS have to look really carefully at what is the evidence. Is there a likelihood that this will result in as a prosecution? And of course, where somebody has already been prosecuted, then they have to take other factors into account as well.
We move on with the final question concerning the Warboys case. Richmond Park Conservative MP Zac Goldsmith said it would be utterly perverse, dangerous and cruel to allow him to live in London. Do you agree?
I'm not going to comment on that. What I would say, I do understand why victims feel very concerned about this. I'm part of the criminal justice system as well. The parole board, the parole board are part of the criminal justice system. They have their decisions to make. If I start commenting on every decision they make,
if you heard he was
that would be wrong. And I know that at the moment there is a judicial review going on, at least one judicial review. So we don't know what is going to happen.
But at one point in the future, whether it's this year or next, would you have concerns about Mr. Warboys living in London?
In the Metropolitan Police, we have to work with and help the probation service supervise a whole variety of sexual offenders. There are people arriving back from prison very, very regularly into London streets. If we end up having to do that, we will do the job to the very, very best of our ability. But I do understand why previous victims and indeed the general public are concerned about this. Yes, of course I do.
Let's get other calls in. David's in Norwich. David, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning, Nick, and good morning, Governor.
Morning.
I am obviously an ex-Met CID officer.
I got that with the morning, Governor. I was kind of with you there, David. On you go, sir.
Well, I stood as for UKIP in the Police and Crime Commission for Norfolk in 2016 and tried to push a particular issue. A major worry about an awful lot of people is we've got a massive amount of assets, i.e. ex or retired police officers, especially CID officers, in London and home counties that could be used to deal with this huge influx of organised, let's just say, Eastern European crime and terrorism, and it's not being used. And I know it's not the government's problem; it's down to the government. But if they could actually use that, if we could actually bring them in and use them, it would be fantastic help to the police across the country.
You're talking about freshly retired officers, are you? Is that what you're hinting at, David?
Well, yeah, I mean, I met the governor years ago when I was in the job as well, so we're pretty much the same sort of age. But I mean,
young with your whole careers ahead of you. David, stay on the line. Let's get the governor or commissioner involved. Commissioner.
So, David, we are actually encouraging people to come and help us in a variety of different ways. As you know,
you mean ex-officers?
Yeah, ex-officers. Yeah. As you know, we have, for example, lots of volunteers. We have lots of special constables, but we're also taking people back in to do things like training our new DCs, our new detectives, as they come in. We have lots of recently retired people coming back to work on specific inquiries for us. So actually, if you looked at the Met at the moment, we've got many more of our recently retired people helping us than we did have sort of two.
Do they?
There are some that don't because they don't want to, and there are many that do. We are absolutely trying to make the most of our recently retired skills. And indeed, we recently wrote out to everybody. I think my deputy wrote to people who'd retired in the last year with exactly the suggestion you're making, Dave. Of course, there is a limit to our resources, as you know very well, but we do recognise there's a great pool of talent out there.
Thanks for that, David. Simon, you're on the phone a minute. On the subject of resources, the National Police Chiefs Council for the Home Office reveals that the counter-terrorist police teams asked for a rise of funding of £104 million, but the Home Office announced last week it will receive only £50 million. How acute does that make your crisis in that area?
Well, I think you're referring to an allegedly leaked document.
Yes.
You're right to say that we have
are the figures correct?
We put in bids before Christmas, both in counter-terrorism and in what might be called the more general policing grant. We have been given, as you know, some assistance in the Met through the possibility of, first of all, an increase in central government funding, and secondly, a room for the Mayor to increase his precept. That will alleviate some of our problems. It's not as much as I would have liked, but it's better than nothing. And I would say the same on the counter-terrorism side. We've got a big review of contest going on. We all know the threat has gone up. We all know the teams are working incredibly hard, and there's an enormous amount of work to do. So you
recognise these figures, Commissioner?
I'm not going to talk about those figures. We never talk about the counter-terrorist figures. Somebody may have leaked a document, but we don't talk about the specific figures. No, we don't.
But if it was right that you get less than half you asked for, what does that mean for the fight against terror?
If we got very, very, very much less than we asked for, it makes it harder. Of course it makes it harder. But the government have their job to do. And I respect that.
But when
and my colleagues respect it as well. But I think there will be room, and you will perhaps have seen in the Home Office response, there may well be room for us in the coming months to put in a further bid, and that is absolutely what we will be doing if there is that room to do so. Meanwhile, we have got some extra resources. And we are building up the capability of the terrorist teams.
OK. Last time we spoke, I think there were 9 plots that have been failed since March 2017, so that's almost 12 months, isn't it? Almost a year. Is it still at 9, or have there been subsequent ones?
No, it is now 10. So it's 10 since March last year. So that's 10 lethal, murderous attacks that people intended to carry out, we say, which have been stopped by the fantastic work of the intelligence agencies and the police.
Well, hear to that. And I remember last time we spoke, some of them were perilously close to
Absolutely.
All of
terrifying, yeah. And you will have seen, the sentencing last week of Darren Osborne, horrendous attack at Finsbury Park, and the judge saying, no, this was a terrorist attack, and he's got, thank goodness,
a nice meaty term.
A very strong sentence.
Let's try and fit in one more. Simon in Edgware, you're on the radio. Go ahead, you're through to the Commissioner.
Yes, morning.
Morning.
With the events and the dangers of knife crime, of course, at the time, Theresa May, at the time, was Home Secretary, reduced that significantly. You and your office have been speaking for the best part of 6 months about increasing that. I'm still waiting for a date, and as a Londoner, I want to know when you are going to put that back into operation at the levels it should be. That
you're talking stop and search. You're talking stop and search. Yeah. Well, I don't know whether you were listening right at the top, but in fact, I'll let the Commissioner repeat it. But in fact, the Commissioner has said that it is now going. It has to be intelligence-led. The officers feel a greater degree of comfort because they're carrying body-worn video cameras, and indeed the Commissioner herself was involved in something relating to that. So it's just to underscore, and you'll understand, Commissioner, Londoners are very concerned. They see, sadly, often on the pages of the evening paper here, there's young men who've fallen victims or they have experienced themselves. It's just confidence that you are prepared. If it's intelligence-led, properly executed, you believe in stop and search.
I completely believe in stop and search, and I want my officers to be confident to use stop and search. They are using it more and more. If you look at the figures for last year, you'll see we've taken thousands and thousands, I think it's about 4,000 knives off the streets, many of which came through stop and search. Stop and search is increasing, and I expect it potentially. I'm not going to order people to do it. I can't say it will go up, but I do expect it to continue to go up in the coming weeks and months, because I'm putting more people out on the streets in the areas where we need them to bear down on knife violence and other associated violence.
Just before you go, this is the first time I've seen you professionally since it's announced that Mark Rowley will be standing down. He, of course, has had the counter-terror brief. What sort of job has he done?
He's done a fantastic job. He's been with us for 3 years. They've been very demanding years. You'll know it's the time when the threat from Syria to the UK and all sorts of other threats actually have increased a very great deal. And he, I think, did a wonderful job last year in all those terrible, terrible events. He led his officers and staff incredibly well, and he spoke very powerfully to the public and gave people great confidence in our ability to respond. We responded in a really resilient way as a city and indeed as a country, and that's partly because of Mark. So we wish him well.
Big shoes to fill, Commissioner.
Well, one of the legacies he's left behind is lots of talented people. We've got a great team. It's always about the team, and we've got a great team. So I'm confident about the leaders of the future.
Always good to have you in the studio, and thank you, and to the men and women who serve under you. Thank you. That's Metropolitan Police Commissioner Cressida Dick. Coming up after the news, one of the alleged people behind the Hyde Park bombing back in the 1980s. Will he now face justice? And to the stock market, down 160 points. We'll monitor that as well right after this. 8:31 LBC News. Simon Conway.
The Met Police Commissioner has insisted on LBC that her officers act impartially. It follows the collapse of several rape cases and trials following a failure from police to disclose crucial evidence, including text messages. Cressida Dick says the issues are partly due to workload and a lack of resources.